Nobody wants to say it out loud, but something dirty was happening inside the Cleveland Browns organization. Because overnight, one of the most hyped young offensive minds in football went from future head coach to completely erased from the building. And the reason why? It all connects back to one name, Shedeur Sanders. Tommy Rees didn't just lose a promotion. He got cut off. No second interview, no backup role, no soft landing, just gone. And when that happens this fast, it usually means something bigger was exposed behind closed doors. For months, fans kept asking the same question. Why wasn't Shedeur getting real first-team reps? Why did the so-called quarterback competition feel fake? Why did every decision seem stacked against him? At the time, people brushed it off. They said trust the coaches, trust the system, trust the process. But now the system is collapsing. Kevin Stefanski is out. Rees is being pushed out. And suddenly insiders are leaking what players already felt in the locker room, that loyalty mattered more than performance, and politics mattered more than development. What's even crazier? While Shedeur was being held back, Rees was the one calling the plays, designing the offense, controlling the opportunities, and according to reports, he wasn't even on Shedeur's side. So the real question is this: was Tommy Rees just caught in bad timing? Or was he quietly helping sabotage the Browns' future quarterback? Because once you see what really happened next, the entire story changes. What happened in Cleveland didn't start with Tommy Rees. It started with the complete breakdown of leadership at the top. Kevin Stefanski didn't just lose games, he lost the locker room. Players stopped buying into the system. Energy dipped. Frustration started leaking into public interviews. And behind the scenes, ownership was already questioning everything. According to reports, the Browns' front office began hearing uncomfortable feedback. Not just about play calling, not just about game management, but about favoritism, internal politics, and a coaching staff that was more focused on protecting each other than winning football games. That's when the dominoes started falling. First came Stefanski's exit, and the moment he was gone, something interesting happened. The protection bubble around his inner circle disappeared too. Suddenly, people who were once untouchable were getting evaluated differently, and right at the center of that circle was Tommy Rees. Rees wasn't just another assistant. He was Stefanski's hand-picked guy, promoted fast, trusted heavily, given control of the offense. Their careers were tied together. So when the Browns began their head coach search, everyone assumed Rees would be safe, maybe even elevated, but instead of getting backed, he got cut off. No second interview, no support, no future in the building. And that raised one massive red flag. Because teams don't usually move this fast unless they're trying to distance themselves from something specific. And that something leads straight to how Shedeur Sanders was treated all season long. On the surface, Tommy Rees looked like the perfect rising star. Young, offensive genius label, experience at Notre Dame and Alabama, fast promotions, media praise, the whole package. But inside the Browns building, his role was very different. Rees wasn't operating independently. He was tied at the hip to Kevin Stefanski. Their relationship wasn't just professional, it was strategic. Stefanski brought him in, elevated him, put him in position to control the offense. And in return, Rees stayed loyal, quiet, compliant, no pushback. That loyalty became a problem. Because when controversial decisions were being made, especially at quarterback, Rees didn't challenge them. He didn't advocate publicly. He didn't create pressure for change. Instead, he backed the system exactly as it was. And players noticed. Reports started floating around that the locker room wasn't feeling Rees. The energy felt off. Communication wasn't clicking. Some players felt the offense lacked direction. Others felt certain guys were being protected while others were getting buried. And when ownership began digging into why the offense struggled so badly, Rees's name kept coming up. Not for creativity, not for innovation, but for being part of the inner circle that refused to adapt. That's when the Browns' front office reportedly started asking a dangerous question. Was Rees actually developing talent, or was he helping preserve a broken hierarchy? Because once you look at what happened with Shedeur Sanders specifically, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. And that's where things start getting uncomfortable. This is where the Browns' situation stopped being about coaching philosophy and started looking personal. All season long, fans were told there was a quarterback competition, that Shedeur Sanders and Dylan Gabriel were battling it out, that the best player would earn the job, that reps were being handed out fairly. But what people started noticing didn't match the narrative. Shedeur wasn't getting first-team reps. He wasn't getting consistent practice time with starters. He wasn't being put in real game prep situations. Meanwhile, the gap kept growing, and once that happens, the outcome is already decided. Because you can't win a competition, you're not allowed to compete in. Insiders began suggesting that this wasn't accidental, that the coaching staff, including Rees, had already picked their guy, and instead of letting performance decide, they structured the system to protect that choice. Even when Shedeur finally got opportunities, the margin for error was brutal. One mistake got magnified. One bad drive got criticized, while others were given room to develop. And here's the part that made fans furious. When Shedeur stepped in late in the season with minimal prep and zero rhythm, he still kept the Browns competitive. He led scoring drives. He fought through pressure. He gave the team chances to win. Yet somehow, that still wasn't enough to change how he was treated. Which led many to ask the question no one inside the building wanted to answer. Was Shedeur ever supposed to be the starter in the first place? And if not, who made that decision? Because the trail keeps pointing back to one man calling the plays. Just weeks earlier, Tommy Rees was being talked about as a future head coach. Media outlets labeled him next up. Insiders said teams were watching him closely. Some even believed Cleveland might promote him internally. Then everything flipped. Rees got his interview with Browns ownership. He sat down with Andrew Berry. He pitched his vision. He made his case. And after that, silence. No second interview, no follow-up meeting, no continued conversations. Meanwhile, other candidates were getting called back. Jim Schwartz got another round. Outside names stayed alive. Rees, completely removed. That's not normal. Teams don't usually cut off their own offensive coordinator that fast unless something serious changes behind the scenes, especially when that coordinator is supposed to be helping develop your young quarterback. According to insiders, the Browns didn't just decide Rees wasn't head coach material. They decided he might not belong in the building at all. Reports started surfacing that it was unlikely Rees would return in any role. Not demoted, not reassigned, gone. And that's when the dots started connecting. Because at the exact same time Rees was being erased from the coaching search, stories started surfacing about locker room tension, about coaching loyalty, about how Shedeur was handled. It wasn't about resume anymore. It was about trust. And when ownership started hearing what players were saying, when they realized the offense wasn't just struggling on the field, but breaking down internally, Rees's future in Cleveland collapsed overnight. But the most damaging part, what ownership reportedly discovered about Rees's involvement in Shedeur's situation. And that's where this story gets explosive. This is the moment everything became impossible to ignore. Because when the Browns officially moved forward with their head coaching search, Rees didn't just lose momentum, he got completely sidelined. Reports started coming out that Cleveland had crossed his name off the list. No follow-up interviews. No, we'll circle back. Just done. And the timing was wild. The Browns were openly saying they wanted an offensive-minded coach to help develop Shedeur Sanders. Rees was already in the building, already running the offense, already familiar with the roster. On paper, he should have been the easiest option. But instead of being prioritized, he was passed over. Meanwhile, Jim Schwartz, the defensive coordinator, was getting called back for a second interview. Ownership reportedly moved fast to keep him in play after hearing other teams were interested. That tells you everything. Because while Rees was losing support, Schwartz was gaining it. Players publicly backed Schwartz. Leaders in the locker room praised his leadership, his energy, his connection with the team, and that contrast made Rees's situation look even worse. Insiders started suggesting that Rees didn't just fail the interview process, he failed the trust test. When ownership started reviewing how the offense was handled, how the quarterback situation played out, and how internal loyalty affected decision-making, Rees's name kept popping up in uncomfortable conversations. Not as the solution, but as part of the problem. And once that narrative took hold inside the front office, his head coaching chances didn't slowly fade. They disappeared instantly. But what pushed ownership over the edge wasn't just interviews or resumes. It was what they reportedly uncovered about Rees's role in the Shedeur Sanders situation. And that's where things turned serious. This is where the story gets uncomfortable for a lot of people. Because according to multiple reports and insider chatter, Tommy Rees wasn't just following orders. He was actively aligned with the decisions that kept Shedeur Sanders on the sidelines. Now, to be clear, nothing has been officially confirmed by the Browns, but sources close to the situation claim Rees supported the plan to limit Shedeur's first-team reps, that he stayed on the same page as Kevin Stefanski instead of pushing for a real competition. And that matters, because as the offensive coordinator, Rees controlled the playbook. He controlled practice installs. He controlled how much trust the quarterback received in real game situations. If he believed in Shedeur, he had power to show it. But insiders suggest he didn't. Instead, Rees allegedly chose loyalty over development, protecting his mentor, protecting the system, protecting the original quarterback plan. Even when Shedeur showed flashes of potential, the leash stayed short. And that created a dangerous dynamic. Imagine being a young quarterback trying to prove yourself while the guy calling your plays never wanted you starting in the first place. Every mistake feels heavier. Every rep feels judged. Every opportunity feels temporary. That's not development. That's survival mode. And when ownership started reviewing film, practice data, and internal feedback, the pattern reportedly became clear. Shedeur wasn't struggling because he lacked talent. He was struggling because the system never fully supported him. And once that realization set in, Rees's position in Cleveland became impossible to defend. But what made this even more brutal was what happened next. Because while Rees was being pushed out, someone else was being pulled closer to the head coach chair. And that contrast exposed everything. While Tommy Rees was quietly losing support upstairs, Jim Schwartz was building something completely different inside the locker room. Players trusted him. Not just respected him, trusted him. Reports say Schwartz had strong relationships with team leaders. He communicated clearly. He held players accountable without losing them emotionally. And most importantly, the locker room actually believed in his leadership. That became public when Denzel Ward spoke out and openly endorsed Schwartz for the head coaching job. That wasn't media spin. That was a Pro Bowl leader telling ownership, "This is our guy." And that moment mattered more than people realize. Because when players speak up like that, it sends a message. It tells management who has real influence and who doesn't. And the contrast couldn't have been sharper. On one side, you had Schwartz backed by players, respected by veterans, trusted in big moments. On the other side, you had Rees, tied to a collapsed coaching regime, surrounded by locker room frustration, and connected to controversial quarterback decisions. Ownership didn't need to overthink it. If the Browns were serious about rebuilding culture, about resetting leadership, about creating a system where young players like Shedeur Sanders could actually grow, Rees wasn't the answer. Shedeur represented stability. Rees represented the past. And once that line was drawn, the Browns made their move. They didn't just choose a different coach. They chose a different direction. But here's the part that makes this story even more interesting. Because Rees isn't expected to just disappear from the league. And where he might end up next raises even more questions. And this is where the entire story flips. Because despite everything stacked against him, Shedeur Sanders still showed up. When he finally got real opportunities late in the season, he didn't fold. He didn't panic. He didn't look overwhelmed. He stepped into chaos and kept Cleveland competitive. He led late-game drives. He stood in the pocket under pressure. He gave the Browns a real chance to win games that mattered. And he did it with almost no preparation. No consistent first-team reps. No offense built around his strengths. No coaching staff fully invested in his development. Just raw talent and survival instincts. That's what made ownership start paying attention. Because once the film was reviewed, once executives saw what Shedeur was doing with limited support, the question changed from, is he ready? To, what happens if we actually build around him? That's when the organizational shift started. Reports suggest Cleveland is now targeting offensive linemen in the draft, wide receiver upgrades, coaches who specialize in quarterback development. Everything is slowly being reshaped with Shedeur in mind. For the first time since he arrived, the franchise isn't treating him like a backup project. They're treating him like a future centerpiece. And that matters more than any stat line. Because quarterback success isn't just about arm talent, it's about belief, structure, opportunity. And now that the old regime is gone, now that the coaches who limited his growth are being removed, Shedeur finally has something he never had before in Cleveland. A real chance. But the final question still remains. Did the Browns act fast enough to save his development? And that's where this story ends, and the next chapter begins. And when you step back and look at the bigger picture, this wasn't just about firing a coach. This was Cleveland finally admitting something went wrong. For months, fans were told to trust the process, that the coaching staff knew best, that Shedeur just needed time, that the quarterback situation was being handled fairly. Now those same coaches are gone. Kevin Stefanski is out. Tommy Rees is being pushed out. The entire group that controlled the quarterback decisions has been dismantled. And that alone tells you more than any press conference ever could. Because if everything was truly fine, there would have been no need to clean house this aggressively. Instead, ownership chose to reset the culture, remove loyalty politics, remove favoritism, remove systems that held young talent back. And that decision might end up saving Shedeur Sanders' career trajectory in Cleveland. Now the Browns have a real opportunity in front of them. They can bring in a coach who actually believes in Shedeur. They can build an offense that fits his strengths. They can surround him with protection and weapons. And if they get this right, this entire sabotage era will just become a footnote in his story. But if they mess it up again, history will repeat itself. So here's the real question for you. Do you think Tommy Rees deserved to be pushed out for how Shedeur was handled? Or do you think Cleveland went too far cleaning house? Drop your honest take in the comments. If you believe Shedeur finally got a fair shot, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want real breakdowns without sugarcoating. And turn on notifications, because this Browns offseason is about to get wild, and you won't want to miss what happens next.